Good morning. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's webinar on the way out of the conflict that we're experiencing in Ukraine. My name is George Beebe. I am the director of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute. We are a transpartisan think tank in Washington that is working to build a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. In our research and writing and through our advocacy efforts, we're promoting ideas that move U.S. foreign policy and national security policy away from global domination and military adventurism and toward a new strategy of diplomatic engagement and the defense of our country based on the interests of the American people, not the corporate and political interests that have fueled American wars for the last 70 years. So today, I am honored to welcome a distinguished panel of experts. Thomas Graham is Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Michael Kimmage is Director of the Wilson Institute's Kennan Center. And Monica Duffy Toft is Professor of International Politics and Director at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School. Let's talk now about the topic at hand. I will mention as an introduction that the Quincy Institute has just published a paper on the sources of U.S. leverage in attempting to bring about a peace settlement in Ukraine. I happen to be one of the co-authors on that, along with Anatol, Lieven, Mark Episkopos, also of the Quincy Center. And I want to focus today on this question of how do we get to a durable and lasting peace settlement in Ukraine. So I want to pose a question to all three panelists to start out. For the past 3-some years, we've heard from the Biden administration that it was up to Kyiv, up to the Ukrainians to decide when and if to seek a peace settlement. The West would back Ukraine for as long as it takes, although we didn't really define what it was in that, but presumably that was either to win the war or to negotiate some sort of advantageous settlement. The mantra was nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and it's really up to the Ukrainians to decide, when to or if to enter negotiations. We're obviously hearing a very different line from the Trump administration. Trump has pledged to end the war and to end it very soon. And the rhetoric of the past 2 days, I think, has made it quite obvious that he is sending signals to Ukrainian President Zelensky and to skeptics in Europe that they're not going to have a veto over whether to seek an accord. The outlines of the accord itself might be a different matter, but this is a much different approach than what we've experienced over the past several years on this. So the question to panelists, conventional wisdom says that without Ukrainian and European buy-in, a settlement will be impossible. Do you think that's true? Monica, you want to start? I think you might be on mute, Monica.
Thank you. All right, great. So European buy-in. So I think the situation, first of all, we're in a period of whiplash where it comes to foreign policy. So, as we start this conversation and when we were thinking about this panel, things were very different 2 days ago, right? So although the, Munich summit, the security conference, people had an intimation of what was going on with the negotiations. But what's striking is that I don't think we can have a permanent settlement without the Europeans. We can have a settlement. We've had wars that were settled without regional actors, vital key actors in the past. We can think about Korea, right? North Korea was involved a bit, but South Korea wasn't. Even World War II, you could make the case. World War I, the Germans were left out. Kosovo, former Yugoslavia. So we've had instances where states that were party to the war were not part of the settlement or were absolutely vital to sort of the longer term. And we see where a number of them went. They were not permanent settlements because the neighbors, the regions, and then of course the parties themselves, and here I'm thinking about Ukraine, obviously have vested interests in what that any kind of settlement is going to be going to look like. And then secondarily, given the level of destruction, this is a highly developed country with massive destruction, large scale killing, infrastructure a mess. They're going to need former trading partners, the Europeans, right, to come in and to help with that rebuilding effort. So on the one hand, yes, in absolutely pragmatic terms and theoretical terms, a settlement can happen without the Europeans, but it's probably not going to be a permanent settlement. I think the best we'll get is a ceasefire, and maybe sort of a calming for a period. But the idea that we're going to get a permanent settlement to the war without European engagement is unlikely to happen.
Michael, your takes?
Thank you so much, and 2 points, George. And first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to discuss these questions with yourself and with such a distinguished group. First point is that it's absolutely President Trump's right to, in effect, to do what he's doing. He campaigned on ending the war. He campaigned on doing it at terms that might be difficult for Ukraine to accept. He won the election, and he is where he is. And I don't think at the beginning, although I might question some of the administration's moves at the present moment in terms of going so quickly to meet with Russian counterparts, but putting that point to the side, I don't think that it's wrong to have a U.S.-Russian conversation at the beginning. And what I can understand with the new administration in Washington is that they don't want to get bogged down. So you go to Kiev, you go to Brussels, you go to Berlin, you go to London, you go to Tallinn, and you're going to get different approaches, answers, points there, and you could do that forever. So I can understand why they would want to break the logjam and sort of push in the direction of negotiations to make something happen and to honor campaign promises and pledges that were made over the course of the last calendar year. Second point, though, is that everything rests not on the format of negotiations, whether they're bilateral, multilateral, with the EU, without the EU, with full participation of President Zelensky or not. Everything rests on the content of the negotiations. And here it's just very difficult to understand, and maybe this is a strategy on the part of the Trump administration. It's very difficult to understand what the nature of the concessions are going to be, what the territorial configuration of Ukraine is going to look like at the end of these negotiations, if they succeed, what the nature of the security guarantee is going to be to Ukraine, if there's going to be a U.S. security guarantee at all. And those are all issues in which there are huge European equities, and especially Poland and the Baltics are not duty-bound to accept what Moscow and Washington might agree to. And Germany and Western Europeans are going to have their say as well down the road. So the content of what's going on now is fundamental. Too soon to say, but I think that we're very far from any kind of collective agreements on those points. It all seems simply up in the air. So, good to make a move, but the content is going to determine everything.
Tom? Tom, I think you're muted. Still muted.
Okay, you can hear me now, right?
Now we can.
I gave me 30 seconds to think of something to say, right? In addition to what has already been said. First, I agree that President Trump is within his rights to start a dialogue with the Russians. I think that's very important. It's hard to see how you move the crisis to a settlement without a direct conversation with the Russians. The Russians are going to pay attention to what comes out of Washington much more than they are what comes out of Kiev and Brussels or other European capitals. So I think this is a critical element. But I agree with what has already been said. It's hard for me to imagine an enduring settlement of this conflict without the participation of the Ukrainians, without the participation of our European partners. They do have equities at stake. They do have levers of influence that they can use to continue the conflict if what Moscow and Washington come up with is or they believe is contrary to their interests. That said, I don't believe that the intention of the administration going forward is to keep this solely as a conversation between Russia and the United States. Yes, it was important to kick it off. That sends a signal that we're serious about this process. But I would note that Keith Kellogg is in Ukraine today, and I would imagine that one of the things he is discussing is U.S. plans, Ukrainian interests, and that will be factored some way into the conversation down the road. We will also have consultations with our European allies, and that will be factored into the conversation down the road. And the final point here is the Russians themselves do have some interest in the United States having those types of consultations. They are not interested in a simple ceasefire. They've said that repeatedly. They want a settlement that deals with what they call the root causes of the conflict. They get into issues of European security. And I think the Russians themselves are savvy enough to know that that will require fairly close consultation between the United States and our European allies if we're going to be able to move this towards a resolution that does lead to an enduring settlement, not only of the conflict in Ukraine, but a broader settlement that lays out the conditions, the structures, and the way we're going to manage European security going forward.
So I'd like to follow up on this question. It sounds like there's a pretty strong consensus that the Europeans and Ukrainians have to play a part in this process eventually, that the initial discussions may not yet be the time, but the time will come when they will have to play a role. What kind of leverage do they have to exert influence on what ultimately gets put in a draft settlement? Are they able to essentially put a stick in the spokes of the process? And short of that, can they ensure that European interests, to the degree that there are collective European interests, and Ukrainian interests are reflected in this? What kind of sources of leverage do they have? Monica?
Thank you, George. I mean, they have a number of points of leverage, and Tom's already alluded to some of them, that they have interests in the area, and Russia has interests in the area as well. Obviously, I mean, trade, economics, right? Russia would love for the sanctions to be released, and for natural gas and oil to keep flowing to Europe or back flowing to Europe. So that's a big one. The other one is how they deal with the Ukraine security situation. And as Michael and both Tom have already alluded to, the devil's in the details here. And one of Putin's red lines, he would like a neutral Ukraine that's not tied in security terms to the West. And so the question is what can Europeans offer, back in order that Russia, under Russian President Putin, is not fearful that Ukraine is going to pose a threat. Another is the political situation. This is a red line for Ukraine. Putin would like the denazification of Ukraine, which means Zelensky's out, elections are in, and we know in the current era that with the disinformation, misinformation, and election engineering that's going on, I think we should all be wary, including the Europeans, the United States as well, about holding elections in this sort of environment. And so one is that the Europeans telling the Russians, don't mess around or muck around. And so they could be monitors, right? Helping to monitor elections. So a couple, political, economic, security, they do have some tools. The big question for me, though, is can the Europeans pull it together as a community? You do have the Poles and the Baltic states who are terrified, right? And then you've got Germany, France, and others who, seem to be making moves and perhaps not consulting and recognizing even within the European Union that there's differences of opinion about how to negotiate. And so I think that is the critical thing with the Europeans, is can they pull it together as a union, as a collective, in order to say, okay, these are the sorts of pressure points we can bring, the concessions we're willing to offer, in order to get Putin to play along nicely and accept the settlement, and for Ukraine itself, under Zelensky, to accept any terms of a settlement that might be forthcoming.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to put this question to you in a more pointed form. After J.D. Vance's talks in Munich and the opening of talks in Saudi Arabia between Russian and American officials, Kaja Kallas came out with a very strongly worded statement that A, this is appeasement. B, if the United States attempts to cut out the Ukrainians from the process and the Europeans, that Ukraine will resist and we will support them. I think that's a direct quote. Is that actually realistic? Can the Europeans simply say no and support Ukraine in pursuing a non-negotiated approach to this?
Well, it's not science fiction, and it's not the height of realism either, because you can see from the conversations that have been going on in Europe in the last couple of days, and certain thresholds have been crossed that weren't crossed before, right? A British prime minister speaking of sending troops. Of course, Emmanuel Macron had speculated about that earlier, but this seems, in effect, closer to happening. But then you look a little bit more deeply into what he's saying, and he's assuming that there's going to be a U.S. backdrop to his doing that. So without a U.S. backdrop, you do wonder if most countries in Europe would be willing to enter the war in the way that Kaja Kallas was describing. And so that could be a kind of point of bluster, but not a matter of genuine leverage. But, as you said a moment ago, George, Europe is varied, and you have one of Europe's major armies in Poland. And I don't think for Poland and the Baltic republics that they would look at what in their eyes would be a kind of unacceptable settlement or some kind of defeat for Ukraine. I don't think that they would look at it passively. And of course, they do have the option. They're sovereign states. They can make their own military decisions. They do have the option of entering the war. So it's a kind of nuclear option in a sense in this situation. It's not off the table, but it's very far from happening at the present moment. And let me just tack on one point to Monica's excellent points about Europe writ large, and this is to focus in on the kind of leverage that Ukraine has. And just skimming the surface of a complicated point, Ukraine has been occupying Russian territory since July in Kursk Oblast. So that's one piece of leverage that Ukraine has in this situation. And also Ukraine has really developed its own drone technology and other military tools in the course of the war. It's been on the avant-garde of the biggest 21st century war now for 3 years. And there's a lot of stuff that Ukraine could do in Russia that it's not doing. It could strike civilian targets in Russia. It could make strikes on Moscow and St. Petersburg, and even a kind of stateless Ukraine in a kind of worst case scenario in terms of negotiations followed by elections in Ukraine and followed by political destabilization could equal a kind of Houthi scenario in Ukraine, where you'd have lots of military capacity, but it wouldn't be state-driven, and yet it would be used against Russia. I mean, that's leverage of a kind. Of course, one hopes that the situation wouldn't come to that, but it's a kind of leverage that's there in Ukraine. So Ukraine has forms of military leverage that it could use or choose not to use, and that's there as one of the many pieces of this hugely complicated puzzle.
Tom, your take on this?
Well, I mean, of course, the Europeans and the Ukrainians have leverage. First, an obvious point, if there's going to be a ceasefire, both sides have to agree to cease fire. And there's no indication that the Ukrainians would back down if they thought that the peace agreement that was negotiated over their heads by the Russians and the Americans didn't meet their minimal security needs. So they would continue to fight for some time. Even in the absence of a continued assistance from the United States, they would get some from the Europeans that would enable them to continue the conflict. I think it's important for us to remember that while the United States has provided the single most aid to the Ukrainians over the past 3 years, if you look at what the European Union has provided as an entity, that amounts to about 60% of it. So the Europeans can continue to fund this operation going forward. The issue that Monica raised, sanctions. You can't lift sanctions without the Europeans deciding to lift sanctions. So it's hard for me to see the outlines of an agreement between Moscow and the United States that could disregard the interests of the Ukrainians, could disregard the interests of the Europeans, and impose a solution on them. These are countries that do enjoy agency, they do have interest, and they do have ways of defending them against what Moscow and the United States might do. I think we also ought to keep in mind that the Europeans have some leverage over the United States itself in terms of trade, for example. And we are in the opening phases of what could be a significant trade dispute at this point. The Europeans will push back on that as well. So it's not only with regard to the actual conflict in the East, but also the overall relationship with the Americans, where the Europeans do have, I think, the ability to do some harm. And that's something that the administration would have to take into account as it deals with Russia going forward.
Great. So I'd like to shift now from looking at the roles of Ukraine and Europe in this to looking at Russia. Here again, we've seen a fairly sharp shift from Biden to Trump. Under Biden, we heard that a negotiated peace really wasn't possible because the Russians allegedly had no interest in ending the war. First, because they were losing, later phases of the war because they were winning, or generally because they were benefiting from the political and economic effects of putting their country on an anti-Western war footing. But now we're seeing that the Russians have engaged, at least in this initial phase, with Trump administration officials in talking about repairing bilateral relations and talking about ending the Ukraine conflict. And I'd like to ask panelists why? How do we understand this? Was Putin always ready to talk, or has something changed that prompted a different Russian attitude to all of this? Tom, let's start with you this time.
Well, look, I mean, Putin has been saying for at least the past year that he's prepared to talk. He's laid out his conditions in June of last year, very harsh conditions that amount to Ukraine's capitulation. So he's always prepared to have a conversation that led to Ukraine's capitulation. What I think has changed over the past couple of months is this willingness, or this hope that Russia will be able to engage in a much broader dialogue with the United States than they would have under the Biden administration. This is not simply about Ukraine, as you noted. This is about a restoration of a broader relationship between the United States to talk about a number of issues that, in fact, should be on the agenda of U.S.-Russian relations, but which the Biden administration was unprepared to talk about. Strategic stability, the Middle East, Arctic energy, security. We can go through the list. From the Russian standpoint, this is a sign of respect from the United States that they've been looking for, an indication that they are indeed a great power, that the United States is prepared to sit down and talk to them as a significant global player. So I don't think you should underestimate the role that respect plays in this. In a strange way, for all the anti-American rhetoric that has come out of Moscow over the past several years, for all the talk about this close strategic partnership with China, the one thing that the Russians want beyond all else is a relationship with the United States that validates them as a great power. We have the power to do that. The Chinese can't do that. Only Washington can do that. And they see an opening for that with the Trump administration. And they have grasped at it quite quickly. And I think they're off to a good start. How far it will go depends on the character of the negotiations. It's much too early to say where we're going to be 3-4 months from now.
So, Michael, earlier you alluded to questioning a little bit how quickly the Trump administration was proceeding along this front. Tom has mentioned that providing the Russians with respect is actually a significant source of leverage for the United States in all of this. In moving as quickly as we have to show that respect, has the United States played that card too soon and diminished its leverage? What's your thought on that?
The answer is I don't know. So I'll give you two thoughts, one in the form of a hypothetical and the other in the form of a bit of skepticism about where things may be trending in terms of how Russia sees this situation. So the hypothetical, we're all Russia watchers of many years by now, and that I think should compel in us a kind of humility that we often don't know as much as we think we know. And it is possible that under the surface in Russia, there's a lot of bravado in the Kremlin about how well things are going, and this is their moment. Certainly a lot of very upbeat messaging in the last week or so about where the war and the negotiations are heading. But one could imagine that underneath the surface, there are a lot of problems. In the summer of 2023, there was a military mutiny in Russia, and it was not without a certain resonance in the population. Inflation has been going up. There are a lot of assessments that, in a year's time, the Russian economy could be in a terrible position. And you could tack onto that a possible realization in Moscow that they're not going to conquer Ukraine, even if they would invade in a bigger way, even if they would go further. And even if the lines would break down as to where they currently are, the Ukrainian lines, it's not as if Russia is on the verge of taking Kiev and really taking control of the country. So negotiations, let's sort of give them the benefit of the doubt for this sake, can explore all of that. And they can explore all of it and derive evidence from the situation that I can't, sitting here in Washington speculating about the Kremlin or Russia's position. So if it is found out that Russia is willing to handle and to deal in the course of negotiations, that would be a great justification of this display of respect and of the tempo that the Trump administration has chosen for itself. But the note of skepticism, beyond what we can infer about where Russia is and how it views the war at the current moment, I don't think the territorial configurations now, if we just freeze it, work very well for Russia. They've expended hundreds of thousands of lives of their own soldiers, huge amounts of money. They've kind of wrecked the relationship with the Western world for the most part, maybe getting repaired in some respects at the present moment, but still sanctions are in effect and all of that. For the sake of what? For the sake of taking Mariupol, for the sake of a land bridge to Crimea, when they're going to have 80% of Ukraine under Ukrainian control, quite aggrieved and hostile toward Russia, and still with a strong relationship to Europe and potentially to the United States. That doesn't seem like it's something that Russia could settle for. It's too little gain for all of the sacrifice that Russia has made. So what is Russia going to ask for in these negotiations? All of the Black Sea coast, Odessa, Kherson? I don't think that the Trump administration would be in a position to make those concessions. I don't want to speak on behalf of the administration in that regard, but that would be, would feel like a huge step for the U.S. and would be very difficult to impose on Ukraine. So maybe Russia is ready to deal. That we'll sort of know in the next couple of months. But I do wonder about freezing the line, which is something that the administration has spoken of quite a bit. Let's freeze the line now. Let's get a ceasefire and let's sort of work on phase two after that. I just wonder if that line works for Russia. In my assessment, it looks like too little.
Monica, your thoughts?
Yeah, so my colleagues have expressed most of the points, but I think, the critical thing is the timing. Why now? And I think we can all agree that, President Trump, he's a deal maker. He and Putin seem to have a special relationship, and Putin seems to trust him. And they're both very transactional. So I think that is a critical feature that has allowed for the negotiations to start. But the other thing is we don't want to underestimate, and Michael already talked about some of the issues Russia is facing on the battlefield, which is it's lost hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million, we don't even know for sure, have fled Russia. So the lifeblood of this country that's already facing a demographic crisis. Reports from both the Harvard's Russia Matters Project and The Economist are indicating that Russian forces in eastern Ukraine are near exhaustion. They're using donkeys, think about this, donkeys to transport ammunition to the front lines. Ukraine just took more territory. And their T-80 tank reserves look like they're only going to last until April. So for Putin to be able to say and declare victory or say, you know, I'm willing to settle at this point, it's the timing is absolutely critical. That I think there are indications, like we can't say for sure. As Michael said, there's a lot that we don't know, but it does feel as if, or it does seem as if reports are correct, that Russia is having a hard time on the battlefield. Trump comes in. We know this, that he was biding his time, initially hoping that the European alliance, NATO, would fall apart, that there would be disagreements. That didn't happen. And now, you know, the war's 3 years in, and they're struggling. You know, inflation's at 21%. It's really high, and that's not good for Putin. To be able to do, you know, to deal with that, and it's continuing to rise. And there does seem to be some momentum on the Ukrainian side. So the timing, I think, you know, is that combination of President Trump coming in, his willingness to negotiate, make deals, and then on top of that, it's the war is not going well, is seemingly at this point for Russia. So I think those two critical factors, George.
Okay, very good. I'd like to ask the panelists one more question before we turn to the audience for their questions, which we have quite a few of. Generally, when you enter into a negotiating process, there are a couple of big things at work. One is trying to figure out where each party's red lines are really drawn, what they absolutely have to have, what they absolutely cannot accept. And then the other thing is looking at sources of leverage to achieve desired outcomes. So I want to ask panelists about this. This is, of course, the very topic of the policy brief that I and my colleagues have published this week, sources of U.S. leverage in these negotiations. I want to ask about Russia's red lines in negotiations and what leverage the Russians have to achieve their goals. What do the Russians absolutely have to have? What can they absolutely not accept? And what kind of leverage can they bring to bear in all of this? I want to start with Tom.
Certainly. You know, I think Putin has laid out sort of clearly what the Russian maximal demands are, and it concerns NATO, the territorial issue, demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification. I think the red line for the Russians at this point is NATO membership for Ukraine. That absolutely is not something that they're prepared to accept at this point. I think along with that, there's another red line, which is no foreign troops on Ukrainian territory, and certainly if the ceasefire line becomes the final runs along the line of contact now, absolutely no foreign troops on territory that Russia considers to be sovereign Russian territory. Those parts of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk provinces, which are still occupied or still controlled by Kiev. So I think that is the absolute red line. I think there's a lot of negotiating room on other issues. I think the ceasefire line is one where there's negotiating room. I don't believe they think they're going to get the demilitarization of Ukraine or denazification of Ukraine. So NATO, that's the key red line. The leverage they have is, well, they can continue to fight. That's one. Two, they can continue this hybrid campaign that they have been conducting in Europe for some time, and can perhaps expand that, intensify it in some ways that make the situation more uncomfortable for our European partners. You know, they always had the option of drawing even closer to China and threatening a closer relationship with China. I think something that the Trump administration is concerned about, and in fact sees its outreach to Russia as part of a larger strategic play that will in some way attenuate the ties between Russia and China to America's advantage. So that's another option. And they can play in the Middle East as well. And they can play on oil prices with the Saudis. So they've got a significant range of levers that they could pull if they so chose, in order to ensure that NATO membership is off the table now and perhaps even forever in any settlement of conflict.
Michael, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think Tom said a lot of things already that are extremely helpful. I'll posit this as a hypothetical red line, maybe going a step further than Tom in terms of what Russia might demand. I'm not sure if it's a demand or a red line, maybe something in between. But I don't think that Russia would be comfortable with Ukraine simply making its own choices on its geopolitical position. And so I think, although I don't think that this is particularly realistic on Russia's part, that there's a sense that they want to call the shots when it comes to where Ukraine is just going to go geopolitically. In a way, that's kind of what the war is about. If you take a 10-year view of it, go back to 2014 and sort of the origins of the conflict. So, if you think back to Minsk negotiations, what Russia kind of wanted was a veto over certain choices that Ukraine might make, political choices, geopolitical choices. So in addition to the territorial issues that Tom mentioned, certainly NATO foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, possibly a real connection, a kind of vibrant connection between the Ukrainian military and Western militaries. Completely independent decision-making in Kiev is not going to be something that Russia is going to accept. And of course, those are huge sticking points in the negotiations, because you can see why Ukraine would drive in exactly the opposite direction, wanting security guarantees that entail foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, continued connection between Ukrainian and Western militaries, and complete autonomy when it comes to Ukraine's geopolitical choices. So that's just the most difficult aspect of this situation. And one might add a further point about leverage to everything that Tom mentioned, which is that what Russia can do now is deprive Trump of the win. Trump has pegged himself publicly, in the campaign, a 24-hour time frame for ending the war. Now it's longer for obvious reasons, but it's clear. And if you look at statements from also the vice president's office, that the U.S. wants a win, and it wants a win relatively quickly. So that now becomes Russian leverage to say, well, you want the win, sorry, you're not going to get it. And we're going to kind of deprive you of something that you want, which is, typical of negotiations and an aspect of this situation.
Yes, and I note that the Trump administration has indicated an openness to holding a presidential summit between Trump and Putin, but they haven't yet committed themselves to that. Which I think is interesting, because obviously one of the things you don't want to do is negotiate with yourselves in this and set up a situation where all the pressure to come to an agreement is on your side, not the other. So that will be a factor to watch in the coming weeks, as to whether we're willing to provide that kind of summit, and how is that tied to concrete progress in negotiating a settlement of this war. Monica, your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you. I think Michael and Tom did a great job, outlining some of them. One thing I want to correct, what I wanted to say was interest rates on small business loans are 21%, but inflation continues to rise. So the economy in Russia is not great. What I would add is, basically, I think for Putin, the red line is that he does not want a Ukraine that's militarily capable of defending itself, or economically independent from Russian influence. I think it's that simple, right? So the economy and the military, right? Ukraine would like to sustain a force of 250. Putin's bandying 80, 85. I'm not even sure he would accept that. And the idea of Western troops on Ukrainian territory, I think absolutely they wouldn't allow that. But one critical piece, my first book was on homeland territories, is Crimea. And the problem is that for both sides, Crimea is basically their Jerusalem. And that is going to be very interesting to see what happens with Crimea. I think the Donbass, Zaporizhia, all of those ceasefire lines can be negotiated. Putin was very smart putting them into the constitution now. They're part of Russian Federation territory. But it'll be, I don't know how the West, the US, Russia is going to sell to the Ukrainians after this horrendous fight that Crimea is going to sit in Russian with Russia, because I can't imagine Putin will settle without having full control over Crimea, and not, I don't think he would even accept a neutral Crimea. He wants that to be Russian territory. So Crimea is a vital point. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out as the negotiations proceed. And then with the summit, yeah, Tom said it beautifully, but I would put a little bit more, I don't know, prosaically, which is Putin wants big boy pants. He wants to be at the table. He wants to wear those. And, the summit is a great carrot for the Trump administration to hold out there and say, well, if you don't go along with X, Y, and Z, that magical summit, is not going to happen. I mean, this is what he did with Kim Jong-un, recognizing him as a world leader. And I think Tom nailed it early, that this respect and status, we forget about that, is absolutely critical. And for Putin, it's vital. And so I think that is one piece of it that's really important. Then hopefully the Trump administration doesn't give that carrot away too quickly. And then lastly is the Europeans. You asked about the timing earlier, George. They are moving very fast. Hopefully they're taking a breath and stepping back and saying, okay, we've got all the world working. The headlines are dominated by this. The Russians are listening. The Ukrainians, maybe, they can negotiate with us, the US, to figure out how to do next steps. Again, we go back to the Europeans. Are we giving our allies, regional bodies, and even China a chance to catch its breath to figure out what the next steps might be, that we can sort of get the best settlement possible out of this?
Just a quick follow-up on that before we move to audience questions. Monica, you've raised this question of territory and disposition of territory, Crimea, where the border is going to be drawn between Ukraine and Russia. I think a lot of people look at this conflict and they say, territory is a zero-sum game. When one side gains, the other side necessarily loses. And they've thrown up their hands and said, how can you settle this? What Russia needs in terms of a territorial settlement, Ukraine will not accept, and vice versa. So, you're caught in a conundrum. Is that in fact the key issue in this war? Can we envision a settlement that agrees to disagree on the concept of territorial exchange, much like the North Korean and South Korean armistice, where neither side recognizes the 38th parallel as the official border between the two sides, but they've also agreed that they're not going to change that by force, and they can end the fighting. Is that a potential way forward here? Tom, your thoughts?
No, absolutely. And I think that's already being discussed. And it's certainly on the Ukrainian side. President Zelensky has said repeatedly over the past several months that he realizes that Ukraine cannot regain the territory through military means. That means if you come to a ceasefire, Zelensky will be looking to diplomatic means, economic means over a much longer period to regain that territory. So I think it's quite likely that we will get a settlement that leaves the Russians in de facto control of the area they now control, but no de jure recognition. That is something I believe the Russians can agree to. They don't need to have de jure immediately. What they're interested is in the realities. If they control it, they control it. And that is, I think, sufficient for their needs at this point. Also important to remember that, there are very few other countries in the world that have recognized Russia's annexation of Crimea, and that includes people that they consider their major partners, like the Chinese. Nobody has recognized their annexation of the other four provinces. So this is something they've lived with for some time. Again, as long as they control the territory, that is sufficient for them at this point, no matter what the legality is in the eyes of the rest of the world.
All right, we have 15 minutes left. I want to turn to audience questions. Tom, you had mentioned earlier that geopolitics, China, for example, is probably a factor in Trump administration thinking about its outreach to the Russians, its desire to settle this war in Ukraine. Question, what kind of role might China have in peace talks? What do you think about the idea of some sort of grand bargain that would involve Trump, Putin, and Chinese leader Xi?
You mean the grand bargain they're going to reach at the May 9th celebrations in Moscow? Which is what I think Putin hopes for. Look, I don't believe in grand bargains. I think they sound great theoretically. They're very difficult to do in practice. I do believe that the Trump administration hopes that by reaching out to Russia, by offering a much broader relationship, that at a minimum they provide something of counterweight to China, that this gives Russia options other than simply siding up with China on a whole range of international issues. Conversations I've had with Russians over the years, including senior officials, would suggest to me that the Russians are also looking for options. Not something they're going to say publicly, but China is always in the back of their mind as a potential challenge, not now, but certainly over the long haul. So there's something to work with here, as long as we manage our expectations. What the administration does with Russia is not going to lead to a rupture in Russia's relations with China. There's no sort of Kissinger in reverse here. I think that's fantasy at this point. But a situation that leads to a much more balanced relationship between Russia and China, and therefore gives the United States some advantage in its dealing with China is certainly possible. And I do believe that that's in the back of the administration's mind, if not in the forefront, is this outreach to Russia as part of a larger geopolitical play.
Mhm.
Other panelists have thoughts on this? Michael?
So philosophically, I think it's absolutely right to put China prominently into the picture when it comes to diplomacy and a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. Ukraine's biggest trading partner before 2022, February 2022, was China, was not Germany, and it was not the United States. China has lots of interests in the southeast of Europe, in the Black Sea, and in Ukraine, and China just has a geopolitical weight at the present moment that means it will be, one way or another, a factor in a situation of such magnitude as the war in Ukraine or a negotiated settlement to the war. So we need to get our minds into that groove, and it's really important. But practically speaking, it just seems so unworkable in a way. I mean, the U.S. has quite a conflictual relationship with China. A lot of members of the new administration feel that China is, sort of challenge or threat number one. There is a kind of new dynamic in the U.S.-Russian relationship, but that's, pretty quickly drawn, and we'll have to see where that goes. And if it's able to stick, you have the Europeans, as we've been discussing. Of course, Ukraine is a crucially important factor to any conclusion to the war. So when you put all this together, it makes the Treaty of Versailles look like a piece of cake. That was simple by comparison to the geometry of this kind of diplomacy. But again, philosophically, it's worth it for all of us, observers, experts, journalists, et cetera, to start thinking in those terms, because China has been a pretty important element of this war all along. No access to the Chinese market. I don't think Russia would have been able to wage this war for 3 years. So it's really important, but my mind boggles when it comes to thinking about how it could all be put together at various negotiating tables and what formats and what kind of agreements and what deliverables one could derive from that. But that may just be the poverty of my imagination.
Mm-hmm. You're muted, George.
Tom and Michael have suggested that China is an important factor, but that the Americans will have to handle this with a fair amount of nuance and subtlety. Do you think the Trump administration can play the China card with that kind of deftness?
I'm similar to Michael. I suspend judgment. I mean, we have to see how it goes. But China, we know, that China values stability. It didn't want this war. It doesn't like the violence. It would love for the global economy just to hum along so that it could keep its economy running. And so if the Trump administration, and we know there's a divide, about how to handle China, whether it's a threat and in what ways is it a threat, to our economy, to our vital interests, to our allies' economies and vital interests. So I think it's too early to tell, George, but I do think that China should be brought in. I mean, it is a global player on this, a major player. Russia could not have prosecuted the war the way it did. And I think there are interests that the Trump administration can play upon, which is just as Russia's economy is suffering, so is China's. We know that. And so if some sort of grand bargain, at least in trade, could be struck, dealing, but not putting aside our vital national interests on that. I think that Xi's ears might perk up and he might listen, and perhaps they can, strike some sort of agreements along the lines where Putin has more pressure from China, because we know Xi put pressure on Putin early, like last year, a year ago, October, when Putin was saber rattling with nuclear weapons. Xi said, knock it off, just stop. So I think he has been involved. And I think, that China should be engaged as we move forward on this. It has vital interests, and we just have to figure out what they are. And then who in the Trump administration, I'm sure they've got very talented folks who can figure this out. I hope they do.
What's necessary, George, is a reverse Kissinger to get China to put more pressure on Russia to end the war.
Yeah, well, could I just jump in here? I don't think that's going to happen. But think of China's role in the reconstruction process afterwards. This is going to cost billions of dollars and not trillions of dollars. Even if you seize Russian assets, you're not going to have enough money to do that. The Europeans and the Americans together won't be able to do it. The Chinese could play a significant role. And having the Chinese invested in Ukraine in a serious way does, over the long run, provide an element of deterrence against the Russians. So we ought to be thinking creatively about how we engage China. I think it comes post sort of settlement as opposed into the settlement process itself, but still it's an important factor that we need to factor into our own calculations.
Great point.
Very good. So we had a lot of questions on the broader landscape in Europe's security. The Russians clearly believe that the war in Ukraine is in part about Ukraine, but to a great degree is about the European security architecture, Ukraine's place in it, Russia's place in it, what it should look like from Russia's point of view. What do you all think the key elements of European security ought to look like? And how should that affect this negotiating process that has begun in the last week or so? Michael, let's start with you.
That's a huge question and a crucial one. I think that it is very, very important to defend, as a matter of principle, even if the situation on the ground is messy, the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine. So I think that Europe and the United States both, when it comes to negotiations and discussions of the European security architecture, should make that an unequivocal principle. If the war can be moderated or be sort of led in the direction of a ceasefire or an armistice, I have a hard time imagining a kind of document that everybody would sign to end the war, but it could sort of incline in that direction. I think if that were to happen, and if there were to be greater structures of trust on both sides, on the European side and on the Russian side, what would be possible is not agreement on Ukraine. I think that that's going to be just very difficult to achieve for the foreseeable future. But you could start to return to the compartmentalization of relations that had been there from 2014 to 2022 and had been there earlier. So there are lots of issues here. I find myself very much in agreement with the Trump administration. There are issues that need to be discussed between Russia and the West, nuclear issues, climate change, and questions that relate to the Middle East. Whether there's the possibility of agreement is another question, but these are big global issues. They matter, and it would be beneficial if one could move to a more compartmentalized relationship and make progress on some of those issues, even in the absence of complete success or complete progress in Ukraine. So I would say that the West needs to stand its ground on the territorial sovereignty and integrity question in Ukraine. And yet there may be practical arrangements on the ground that begin to moderate the war. If so, compartmentalization should come into view as an option, and there might be quite a bit that could achieve. It's not perfection, but it's sort of an imperfection that's maybe better than where we are at the present moment.
Monica, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with Michael on this one. I think we have to be very clear. I would hope that any sort of settlement makes it very clear that violating the territorial integrity of states with the use of force is not acceptable and does not stand. And this goes back to Tom's distinction between de facto and de jure. It may be the case that Ukraine is going to have to accept that that Russia de facto has control, but that they push down the road, which we've seen this in other peace accords, that the final settlement of the territories, let's get a ceasefire, let's get a settlement, right, where we can start rebuilding the different territories, but then the status of the regions, the different regions, including Crimea, they can be held to a vote in 20 years. They did this after Sudan, right, the North and the South Sudan with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, right? So I think because that is a very scary norm, and this is why somebody talked about appeasement, one of the, we talked about appeasement earlier, because we haven't even talked about the nuclear balance, right? And we talked a little bit about nuclear saber rattling, but that territorial norm, which has been established since 1945, where states are not allowed, we pushed Iraq back out of Kuwait. We need to make it very clear that major powers, great powers, are not allowed to go and tromp around their neighborhoods and take territories. And I'm not just speaking for Russia, I'm talking about other states. We could talk about the United States today. So I think that territorial integrity norm, as codified in the United Nations, that needs to go into this agreement, that is wrong, and that the territory, even if it's not settled, in final legal terms today, that there's a possibility. And you might just, by the way, get Ukraine and Zelensky and company to the table if you hold out hope that maybe down the line we can stop the bloodshed today and then down the line reclaim those territories.
Tom, your thoughts?
Right. I think what we're witnessing is a part of a long historical drama, which focuses on the dividing line between Russia and the West. That line has moved many hundreds of miles to the east over the past 3 or 4 decades. The conflict in Ukraine, in many ways, is part and parcel of that, and it is a question of where we're going to draw that line. I think in the near term, that line is going to be drawn through Ukraine at some point, almost certainly along the line of contact at this point. And the question then will be for the United States, for Russia, Ukraine, and our European allies, is how do we stabilize that frontier? How do we reduce the risk of renewed conflict along a frontier that now extends from the Barents Sea through the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea? And what will come into play is some of the types of arms control agreements that we used during the Cold War to stabilize that frontier. A modification of the CFE treaty, for example, some modification of the INF treaty, things that the Russians are already talking about, and things that we ought to be considering as well. As far as the norm is concerned, you're not going to get that written Benny agreement with the Russians at this point. At most, you could get written in, the two contradictory principles that we have in the UN Charter, which is territorial integrity, self-determination of nations. So I can envision at some point down the road having a referendum on the territory that Russia now occupies to determine what the long-term status of that territory would be. I don't think it necessarily leads to the restoration of Ukraine within its 1991 borders. In fact, I'm quite persuaded that Crimea, if you held a free and fair election right now, would decide that it wanted to be part of Russia. What will happen to the territories that Russia occupies at this point in the long-term future will depend on how those territories prosper or do not prosper while they're under Russian control for an extended period. So stabilize. We're going to draw a line. We need to stabilize that line. We need to defer a final resolution of the territorial issue to sometime in the future.
Well, I think that is an excellent note on which to wrap up this discussion. I want to thank our speakers, Tom Graham, Monica Duffy Toft, and Michael Kimmage for an excellent discussion, some great insights. And thank you in the audience as well for joining us today. Before we sign off, I want to remind you that we have another webinar that is going to be coming up next Tuesday at noon. It is a book talk with Oliver Bullo, hosted by Anatol Lieven. And you can register for that now by going to our events page on our website, quincyinst.org/events. You can also subscribe to the Quincy Institute mailing list from that same homepage, and you'll receive invitations to all our events and be able to follow our work. Thanks again for participating today. I want to remind you that Quincy's latest policy brief on this question of leverage to end the war in Ukraine is available on our website. I encourage everybody to download and read it. Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you in our next event.